Blast off. Recording. Hey, Mr. Pat Flynn.
Chris, it is a pleasure to be back with you yet again.
Yeah, really, man. Seriously. Love the last discussion. Glad you're back. I know from that last dialogue we had, I called it 2X Atheists talk about or discuss dialoguing with atheists. And I got a pretty good response, mostly through email. Actually received some good feedback. And
oh, good.
Now I'm actually having a few dialogues with, well, a couple of folks are like kind of teetering sort of agnostic, and then spiritual, not religious. And then there's one atheist. I've mentioned this in a couple of my past videos. I have a dialoguing with doubters series, on my channel, and discussing with atheists, agnostics, spiritual, not religious. And I mentioned in one of those videos that, a lot of atheists out there, and I love your perspective on this too, because you articulate it really well and separate some of the folks who do have a serious argument versus who don't. But occasionally you get a guy who comes around who's spent a lot of, he or she, they've done their homework, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct homework, which we're going to talk about some of that today, but nonetheless, a lot of teleological, a lot of ontological, conversations.
Yeah, they're in the deeper conversation, and that's certainly so welcome, and that's so appreciated, right? And I think one thing, in terms of finding common ground is just to agree that however you want to cash us out, the truth is valuable, and that we should set truth as our target primarily, fundamentally. Do the best we can to, check ourselves for the biases that we are all filled with at all times. So just to hear that you have gotten into dialogues from our previous conversation and they seem to have been productive is a great treasure. And I'm very happy to hear that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm hoping, as more people see the video, again, the channel has been growing sort of slowly but surely. So I'm making, I'm starting to kind of garner a little more interest and gain some traction, one day at a time. Mm-hmm. Cool. But yeah, it's good to see some progress with that. And I think, as I said before, I think that that video is valuable in many ways. I think you hit on some core topics about truth that are much needed to discuss, really, because it does, as you pointed out, it ultimately bubbles up to that, what is true and what's not true, right? And
right.
So that's
been and I think it is important to first, get clarity and find where people are held up, where the debate actually is, right? Because sometimes a lot of words are wasted on topics that aren't really the topic of debate, if that makes sense. Sure. So, I think in terms from a Catholic perspective, like there's three easy ways we can kind of break it up. It's like, okay, the Catholic Church makes three bold claims. It claims that God exists, that God incarnated, and that God left us with an authoritative institution. And then you can just ask somebody, you're not Catholic, if they're not Catholic, right? Which of those three claims do you have an issue with, right? Or do you not believe, or do you think is unmerited or unwarranted? And then you can kind of focus in on that, right? And then if somebody's going to go for the first pillar, well, then you would be an atheist or agnostic, generally speaking. If somebody goes for the second one, the claims of Christ's divinity, then we might be talking to somebody who's spiritual but not religious, or something like that, right? If somebody goes for the third one, that's going to probably just be your general class of Protestants and Eastern Orthodox and things like that. And then I think it's important, just in dialogue, to just keep, ask at least as many questions as you try to give answers, right? To really figure out, okay, where are we stuck, right? If it's on that first pillar, okay. Why? Like, you give me your reasons. What makes you think that God doesn't exist, or maybe that you think we can't know that God exists, if they take a sort of agnosticism. And I find that is just helpful from a practical standpoint, just for simple common sense reasons. One is people just like to be heard. They like to know that their opinion is being valued, being respected. So it helps to build rapport. Everybody likes that. So everybody's going to appreciate that. And we should sincerely try to do that for anybody that we're talking to. It's not always easy to do that, because we always want to just get to the arguments, right? But you just don't want to throw arguments out there, because they might not be relevant and they can distract from what might be the primary issue. So really just try and gain clarity on where we're at. And yeah, try and see how much have they looked into this. Don't just assume that somebody's a kindergartner when it comes to philosophy of religion or metaphysics, they may have done a serious amount of homework, and that's good to know, because then you can try and focus in on that precise issue where you think they're held up, and just taking the time to figure out where somebody is coming from, asking clarifying questions, and figure out what is the issue, what is the holdup, goes a long way in building rapport and actually helping to facilitate conversations that actually go somewhere. It can be done. It can be, as long as you're willing to be patient. Mm-hmm.
Patient, right? Yeah. So actually, you know what? Since we're already talking about this, let's dive a bit more into this. So I'm thinking sometimes this happens to me. I'll have this sort of burst of ideas now for topics. So I have three in mind. First, let's talk about this, and they all ultimately lead to talking about God and our relationship with God, and through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
First, let's dive a bit more into this then about talking what's spiritual and not religious, right?
Sure.
And that. Second, I'd actually like to get your thoughts on it. In my latest gospel reflection, I talk about the Eucharist, and I want to get a thought about that from you.
Mm-hmm.
And third, I do want to talk about, in our last dialogue, I briefly mentioned the debate between Trent Horn and Matt Dillahunty about is the reasonable to believe in the resurrection. And I kind of just get a little bit on that. We've already had a little bit of discussion, but it's always great to get your thoughts. So going back to spiritual, not religious. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with, and it just prompted me, part of what you just explained. When we're talking about definitions, okay, in the metaphysical realm, okay, last time we talked a little bit about consciousness, and that can sound, again, outwardly a bit nebulous, besides meaning perception and awareness, and then really drilling down from there what that means. But terms like energy, law of attraction, putting, for example, some of the folks who are even promoting this, and become really popular, a popular voice, and what I would call a spiritual but not religious community, that would be your Deepak Chopra's. Oprah Winfrey has had especially in the last 25 to 30 years, has kind of helped perpetuate some of this. And it's interesting how many people have made a shift in recent years, right? They're either falling off from their prior maybe religious background, and then now they're shopping around, which you and I even talked a little about last time, that you were a bit of a seeker in your own way, and I was, and and it's okay to be a seeker, like that's good, seek out the truth, But then we're talking about Brian Holdsworth. He's another YouTuber or two, has a good channel, and I think it was about a week ago, he released a video on subjective truth versus objective truth, and the problem with that right now, and this, going from, and there's a lot to talk about this, so I'm actually going to stop here in a second because I'll give some of my own thoughts after. A lot to unpack about the shift from in finding a relationship with with God, or what people will call like a divine being or something, that they clearly a lot of folks have changed it from more sort of an outward, like I want to connect with a divine, right, and have that connection, that relationship, as some Christians often call it, that personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's one form of it, right? That's what we're talking about, that. But it's shifted a lot, right? To, we hear a lot of this now. It's almost getting kind of really tired and cliche of everybody pointing out that, seems like everybody's really self-absorbed and what's in it for me. And like, I even call the seeking a lot of that right now, like what's in it for me, spirituality. And so that Brian Holdsworth had touched on some of that in his own video, and how, everybody has their own truth, and a lot of the problems with that, when if everybody can create a truth and what that means. So two questions with that, and I'm trying not to make this too abstract. The first is, what are your thoughts on the different definitions out there? Like how you can, if somebody says, well, I believe in energy fields, I think it's the universe somehow is, some cosmic tweaking of our lives as if an energy, right? How do you then somehow bridge that to like moving it towards a conversation about understanding God, right? And then also sort of shifting the conversation from, like, again, what is this going to do for me versus how I'm going to connect with spirituality, if that makes
Right. Yeah. I've had a number of recent conversations with people on this, so there's much to be said. So yeah, where to begin? I mean, your first off, when it comes to New Age spirituality, it will surprise nobody that it's a big tent that includes many different beliefs, and many of those beliefs are mutually exclusive of each. Like, you'll read one New Age spirituality book, and it will say one thing that is contradictory to another New Age spirituality book. So it's not like it's this great harmonic system, right?
Oh, sorry, if I may interject real quick. If you ever have a chance, sorry, Pat. There's a video out there. It's a funny because it's a parody of Spiritual But Not Religious. It's like 2 or 3 minutes, and it's a song basically, and it's a bunch of people in a church, and they're jumping everywhere from the law of attraction to healing crystals to essential oils to
to mushroom retreats and
right. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and yeah. To say that I'm spiritual but not religious strikes me in the same sort of way as somebody who says, well, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative. In other words, I like cliches, but I don't ever think deeply about issues. That's what that tells me, right? And I just want to please everybody. Now that's a snarky and highly uncharitable thing to say, but let me see if I can give something a little bit more substantial here, right? So yeah, I was talking with somebody like a legit, very nice person. I won't mention any names, right? Not too long ago, and into the New Age spirituality stuff and into pantheism, which seems to be like what you were hinting at, right? That whatever else God is, God just is the universe, and we're actually God in a sense, like we're parts of God, right? And so again, like what's the issue? Where are the parts of disagreement? Because she was asking me about Catholicism, and she had this very subjective view of course, religion and spirituality, and using terms like your truth and my truth and stuff like this. So we just start kind of hacking away at it. It's like, okay, all right, so you've got this conception of the divine. Let's try this, right? Because my thought, here's my thought, right, is that whatever else the universe is, it's something that's finite, presumably, in its qualitative aspects. It's contingent. It seems to cry out for a source of extrinsic intelligibility. And, there's been many philosophical traditions that say whatever those types of things are, those are creatures, right? They're not divine, right? They're things that are the product of something that's divine, transcendent of them, the non-contingent absolute. But anything that moves from potentiality to actuality that is qualitatively finite in various respects, that is metaphysically composite, right? We're all still in the category of things that point out towards an extrinsic explanation. So I'm not giving like a formal argument, but I said to my friend, I said, to me, this shows that there's something philosophically inadequate about pantheism. First off, like, I certainly don't feel like God, right? So like, if we don't want to talk from experience, like I feel pretty much the opposite of whatever omnipotent is, right? Even in my most egotistical moments, I don't think I've ever felt that I am really divine in any sense, right? However, it seems like whatever else we think of the universe as being, it's something that not only could, but does stand in need of a source of extrinsic explanation or intelligibility. So as I said, like here's one reason I'm not a pantheist. And one reason I'm not a pantheist is I think the best philosophical considerations of reality actually point to a robust monotheism, that whatever else God is, God is something that's radically distinct from the universe. And the universe is fundamentally something created, something that derives its existence from the non-contingent absolute, which is God. So I said to my friend, like, this here is something that I think can be philosophically adjudicated. Now, she had never thought about it in this way, right? So like, I wasn't expecting to get into a wrestling match over the argument of contingency, but I was identifying, because she wanted to know why I don't think that God is the universe, right? And so I spelled out in as simple terms as I could reasons why I think the universe is not divine, is not the ultimate cause, certainly not of itself. It's not self-explanatory, and that there are good reasons, good philosophical, metaphysical reasons to think that there is a real distinction between the universe and God, right? So that was something. It didn't like change her mind immediately, but it was something that she clearly hadn't ever considered before, right? Reading New Age spirituality books. so it was kind of, and I think, you know, in terms of like real life conversations, not just like internet apologetics, this is how they go, right? You plant seeds, you make suggestions, and you build rapport, and hopefully you can build on it in future conversations, because progress is always made. It's always made over time. Like, when have you ever had a conversation where, especially on worldview conversations, where somebody's ever flipped their mind right away? Like almost never, right? And then, yeah, and then, you know, just kind of throw out some, you know, I think some legitimate worries for why a sort of relativism isn't going to work, right? Like the idea that the truth is relative. It's whatever you want to make it, right? And then you have all the notorious self-defeat issues, right? Is it, you know, that there are no objective truths? Okay, is that objectively true? If it is, then your position is false. If it's not, then we don't need to pay attention to it, right? Just like basic self-defeat issues with taking a very relativistic or radically subjective view of truth. Planting those, I think, can be helpful, because to me, so much of New Age spirituality, Chris, I think you identified it, is a sort of what's in it for me spirituality. And one thing that came up in my conversation with my friend, and I'll let you chime back in here because I want to get your thoughts on what I said so far, is Catholicism seems to be too much about rules, is what she said. She's like, and who are the church, who are priests to tell me how I should have a relationship with God and how I should pray? And what I said to her was this, is like, okay, you can see it that way. And I can see how you could see it that way. Like, I don't want to make it seem like that's just a totally moronic thing. I get how people could see it that way, but let's see it from a different viewpoint. Let's see it from this viewpoint, that God is the creator of all that is. He's the creator of human nature. God knows what perfects human nature, what fulfills it, right? What is going to cause a human nature to be an excellent instantiation or a poor instantiation, right? And that God guides us because God wants us to be excellent, right? And he wants us to be perfectly fulfilled. God wants us to be perfectly happy, and he knows what's going to do that. And then God gives guidelines. He gives a moral blueprint, if you will, to help us achieve our ultimate fulfillment and happiness. And so if there really are bounds to our existence that determine whether certain actions are conducive to our flourishing or not, might it make sense that the creator of those bounds, God, might give us some guidance on how to fulfill that, how to actually live out a really and truly good life? If so, then that might look like rules. But in that sense, rules aren't such a bad thing, right? Rules are for our own good. They're for our own flourishing. And that struck her. She actually liked that response. She said she found that very interesting, and she had never considered it that way before. So for me, it was just trying to acknowledge, okay, I can see legitimately why you would see that, and why that might seem like something that you would want to avoid. But now let's consider it from the Catholic perspective. Now, you don't have to believe the Catholic perspective, but I at least want you to see that there's sense to be made once you see it through that lens of why it would be this way. And then we could talk about what perspective is correct. But let me just get you to see why this actually would make sense from a perspective. And that to me is progress, even if they don't buy the perspective entirely yet. Like, can we get somebody to see that this perspective makes sense by trying to get them to look through it, even before we try to show them why we think that is the correct perspective? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there you go. There's some stuff.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. No, all good points. And I think, well, I have a couple of thoughts. The first is, I was talking with a friend about a week ago about how I'm thinking about making a video about parallels between seeking out a belief, a spiritual walk, and relationships. Okay, intimate romantic relationships, right? I've already in a couple of videos used analogies, used like relationships analogies, because and where I'm going with this is, and then I'm thinking, okay, in my single life, when I did put myself out there some time back and was, out there, looking to meet somebody, and, I started noticing a lot of these parallels. This conversation comes up too, like about what do you believe, right? And I talked with so many people who identify as spiritual but not religious. And to your point about Catholic Church has so many rules, right? That comes up a lot. I found that it's often a a lot of people become spiritual but not religious at a reaction to that, right? That they're like, oh, organized religion. That comes up all the time. I just don't like organized religion, right?
Right.
And now they default into spiritual but not religious. I say this though too, and this is going to sound a little snarky, but it's the same thing when I hear, like, when I was on dating apps and, you read profiles and and you see a lot of, I want to start as friends first, friendship first, friends first, which of course should be part of a relationship, should be best friends together. But it turns out when you strip it down, it's really just more actually a reaction to all bad past dating experiences. Like, it's a protective mechanism. Let's be friends first. Okay, let's start out platonic here, so we're not like rushing in anything or doing anything where we're making any missteps, right?
Sure.
So they default to thinking, okay, if we form a friendship first, maybe that's going to be the better route. And there could be a bit to discuss through with that. But then I relate it to also with organized religion. Like, in other words, these are just like aversions to something, and then that's how they're labeling it, like even with like being spiritual not religious. But then for a lot of the folks who do call themselves spiritual not religious, then some of those folks, just like atheists or agnostics, challenging religion or seeking out religion or doing their own sort of form of seeking, some will do their homework, right? They'll read books out there that, self-transformation or sort of spiritually oriented books, and, resources, or watch YouTube or whatnot, and, start forming some kind of, their own kind of belief system. But just that first, it's a reaction, like, to being against rules, and regulations, which is a whole issue. That's why I mentioned even before I hand it over to you to give your thoughts, that this is because it could blow up into a much bigger conversation about just like first here in the West, okay, and how Western society has changed, especially in the last 100 years, last century, and even more especially within the last 50 to 60 years, and particularly since the beginning of the civil rights movement to now, and having a sort of a shift, right, in society overall of personal responsibility to each other and accountability, right? Just overall, there was just so much more. I can even remember, even as I was a kid and generations before that, that was so much more a foundation of being family and, together in relationships. And that had some of its own good and bad, right? But fundamentally, it's important to have that. Then it shifts to more about, what do I deserve? What do I want? What do I don't want? And this is, again, how I relate it to people getting to know each other for the purpose of a relationship. It's like you draw a line now, and it's like the what I want column and the what I don't want column. But I don't hear a lot of, what do I offer? What do I bring to this? And how I would be responsible, like how two people would be responsible to each other. It's the same thing, I think, with seeking out a belief. Okay, you can talk all day long about what you don't want, what you do want, but then you also have to sometimes dive deep into some of that. Like, why are you spiritual but not religious person, for example, why are you hung up on rules? What is it? Well, sometimes it's certain positions, right? It's something, well, the Catholic Church thinks this, fill in the blank, and usually it's some of the more hot button topics like pro-choice, versus pro-life, and sometimes some of the heavier ones, and or the Catholic Church needs to update some of its teachings, or fill in the blank. But then I found, just in my own experience, oftentimes when I just let's boil it down to what is the issue, I rarely get I think an acceptable answer, or a clear, articulate answer of what bothers me. Just the word rules. You know what I mean? It just kind of causes this kind of immediate like trauma to like when they hear it, and whatever their backgrounds may be, or even their religious upbringing, maybe that's part of it, but it's first trying to crack that, right, and then to be able to talk about at first, why is it that why are you against rules, right? What do you think, and then what is the alternative then for that if you don't agree with the rules? And of course, if somebody says, well, because I've heard this many times, well, everybody has their own truth, right? And if we just follow that, right? Okay. But then that that has so many flaws in it. Like, for example, one of my least favorite sayings is whatever makes you happy. Okay. Right. When you just make these just broad sweeping, okay, just kind of claims, right? Like that, like what, okay, so anything, right? Like, so if I walk up and I'm not this, if I just walk up and want to kick puppies, you know what I'm saying, and run because it just makes me happy. You know what I mean? It's, well, that's even subjective in its own way. Okay. But it's so, and why I'm sort of fumbling around a little bit, and I'm kind of thinking out loud, is because I'm really trying to put my arms around, there may not just be one method for every single person. Okay.
No, there's not. There's definitely not.
Yeah. But how do you, what do
Yeah,
you
well,
with at the core? Let me ask that to kind of, you know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, yeah. I think you start by asking questions again, like, hey, do you think all rules are bad? And I think most people, if they're being honest, are going to say, like, no, rules are there because they help promote our good in some way. I mean, parents make rules for their children. Like, I have rules for my kids. Like, if you're going to cross the street, you better look both ways, right? And that's a rule that's meant to keep you safe. And I have rules for them of how they are to use their speech and how they are to respect other people and all kinds of rules. And why am I doing that? I put those rules in place because I love my children and because I want them to have a good life. I want them to flourish, right? So I think that's important, right? Just like this, get this sort of knee jerk teenage libertarian attitude out of people, right? That rules, just the word rules is as synonymous with like oppression, right? Like, let's just see that clearly isn't the case, right? Like, you might think that some rules have been used for oppressive measures. We're not that far yet, but can we at least grant that other rules are used because people actually really care about the well-being of other people, right? Let's just grant that. Okay, great, cool. Well, now that's a step. That's we've made some progress. Now, what rule do you have an issue with? Right now we can look at any one particular rule if you want to do that. I think it is important, however, in terms of Catholicism, right, to try and get back to the main things as quickly as possible. I found this is true in my issue, because yes, we could go through Church's teachings on dignity of human life, which I think is, of course, absolutely correct, right? I think any position that affirms that the murder of innocent people is somehow morally acceptable is just an absolute abomination. And this was an intuition that I held even in my most skeptical days, right? Like, I never, thanks to God, ever gave up my pro-life intuitions, right? Even when I was like in the most hardened in my naturalism and libertarianism, I was. So I'm taking pokes at libertarian, but I used to be a libertarian myself, right? And the greatest thing that gave me issue with libertarian philosophy was how they could not seem to secure a pro-life philosophy, right? It just seemed like there was a great tension there. That was something that was very undermining and very uncomfortable with my libertarian sentiments at the time. So yeah, we could go through that. We could see why the church is actually right on that. However, or some of the sexual stuff or the marriage stuff or whatever, there's a more fundamental claim that's up for evaluation that I think you got to get people to see, right? And it's not just that the church is right about rules. There's a deeper reason of why we should expect the church to be right about rules, and why we could trust the church on certain rules, if we want to call it rules still, even if we don't see why it's right. And that, of course, is that because God founded the Catholic Church and guides her on matters of faith and morals, there's this question of authority and indefectibility. And so just asking somebody like, hey, look, here's the Catholic claim. It's a big claim, but let's understand what the claim is. The claim is that God incarnated, right? And that he didn't just leave us with a book and said, go make sense of this. Instead, he left us with a successive Petrine ministry, right? With an office, with a magisterium, with a teaching authority on matters, essential matters of faith and morals, as really the vessel of our salvation to help us live the really good life. Now, wouldn't you agree that if that's true, that if God really did give us this church and God guides his church on these essential matters of faith and morals, wouldn't you agree that it would make sense to follow that church? Like, wouldn't you? And to me, this is just a litmus test, because like, who's going to say no to that? Like, only somebody like who's just really insincere, and getting them to see that. Now, they could say, yeah, that makes sense, but I don't believe it. But that's an important point to reach, right? It's just to get them to see the deeper claim, the catch-all claim, the claim of authority. Because if this is true, and you agree that, yeah, if that claim was true, I should trust it, well, then everything else falls into place, right? If the church teaches X and I believe Y, then I should give up Y and conform to X, right? If that central claim of authority is true. So while I think it can be helpful to show initially the reasonableness of the church's quote unquote teachings or rules, at some point in conversations with people, I think it is important to steer back to that, to keep the main things the main thing. Come back to those fundamental claims that will then serve as the sort of that result in a paradigm shift of systems thinking. And once we make that paradigm shift, everything downstream can come into place, rather than trying to like put everything downstream into place first. You see what I'm saying? Like that's just it's too much. It's too much to do, right? You got to get back to the main things and the central claims, I think, if you're going to have a really productive conversation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to tack on with what you just said, and this is just one approach, one angle. I found conversations with spiritual but not religious, and those who, particularly those who say, yeah, I like Jesus. I mean, Jesus seemed like a great guy, great teacher. At least there's a little bit of progress with that. I mean, if you have somebody, for example, who even questions that, Jesus, well, then first you have to get past that. But let's say we start with a person who's open to, like, yes, I've read some of the Gospels about Jesus, and
right.
So then you start, like, and you layer it up. It's like, okay, if you like what Jesus said, then do you believe that Jesus spoke truth, right? Okay, well then if you believe Jesus spoke truth, then is it possible that, right, that he, right, his purpose, right, in him, as God incarnate, right, is it possible then that he could be that, right? It's just kind of doing some basic sort of letter of step that, and if it's that, right, and if we agree with that is possible, then is it possible that the instructions he gave are true? And then if it's possible the instructions he gave are true, right, then that means that, for example, the church we have, right, and all that we do to honor tradition, we do up to this day. So, and I'm kind of oversimplifying this, right, but just to give an idea of, and it kind of goes back to truth again, too. Like, what would you consider true? And then if you consider this true, then this could possibly be true, right? And this could possibly be true. And then it ties into the, rules, for lack of better saying it. But I've also, another thought is, even in my own seeking, okay, and at the time that I was atheist, I look at, things at like, okay, maximum or at the very minimum. So at the very maximum of being Catholic, right, it's all true. And we have this fully rich tradition, through the church and belief and connection with God, right? Now, let's say, okay, or at the very minimum, let's say somehow society just becomes so widely secular, right? And this just keeps, dissipating, right? As belief systems and the Catholic Church too, right? Just saying, just hypothetically, at the very minimum, okay, the Catholic Church, teaches something like, even now, that is so needed, is personal responsibility and accountability to each other, right, and to yourself, and of course, in a spiritual sense, a metaphysical sense, keeping that consistent. Not to downplay it so much, but I'm saying at the very minimum, that's what has always been even so appealing to me about, being Catholic, or even the Catholic Church. I even, when I was atheist, like, somebody said, well, I want, I would say, if you want to explore any faith, I would say I'd actually start with the Catholic faith, for many reasons that we could discuss, and we kind of flesh some of that out. But then we get into the rules and, sort of regulations, how they look at it. And I see it more as like, okay, do you want a world without people being responsible to each other, like really being consistently responsible and accountable to each other, having the morals based on that? Or do you want a world where that's gone? Because that's what you get, or what we're seeing some of that unfold, when it's just everybody has their own truth. You know what I mean? It seems responsibility goes out the window with it.
Right.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument. I've heard people, somebody else that I had a conversation with about this stuff is they grant that. They're like, yeah, I think he himself was not religious, right? But he said, I think we should keep religion around because it's just practically useful for all the stuff that you just said, Chris. So some people are willing to grant that, right? But I think we both agree, okay, That's good. Like, I'm glad you don't want to like try and like persecute the church. That's
Yeah.
awesome, right?
Right.
Although the church kind of likes that. I shouldn't say it likes it, but it tends to thrive from that sort of thing, right? As we know. But great. Good. Okay. But is it true? Right? But is it true? Because I think when I was having this conversation with this guy, and I'm like you, I just love to have these types of conversations, and I have people reach out to me all the time, and very interesting enough, like people that I knew in a past life, like from high school and college, is hey, can we grab a beer because they watched it? I'm like, sure, we'll go do it. And this was one of these recent encounters, and I think that he just kind of thought or assumed that I must have become Catholic because it was just useful in some way. And I said, oh yeah, it's been useful, but it's also true. And like I would not have become Catholic if it was only useful and independent of the truth claims. And so we had, we got into that a little bit, and same thing. Like it just never really. People are the way our culture is, and so many of these conversations, like it just never even strikes them that you could try to adjudicate rationally religious claims. Like this surprises people, and it surprises people when you actually like give arguments. And I don't even mean like get into the technical weeds of arguments, because like they haven't. They don't even know these arguments exist. But I mean, like you just list arguments and like, oh yeah, I'm Catholic because I think it just explains a huge amount of data, right? I think that or just even God. Let's back away from Catholic. Like I think God exists because God is the best explanation for why the universe began to exist some 13.8 billion years ago. God is the best explanation for why the universe has this exquisite fine tuning for the emergence of intelligent interactive life. God is the best explanation for why any contingent thing exists instead of nothing. God is the best explanation for why we experience a realm of objective moral values and duties. God is the best explanation for the irreducibility of consciousness to physical processes. God is the best explanation for near-death experiences, for religious experiences, for miraculous apparitions that have been scientifically scrutinized, right? And then, of course, you can lean in more and say, I think God is the best explanation for all the historical data surrounding Jesus Christ and why the Catholic Church has survived 2,000 years when, on a naturalistic hypothesis, I could never explain something like that. But the existence of God explains that really, really well. Now, nothing I gave there was like we haven't even gotten into any of those arguments, but just like showing people that there are reasons, and seemingly plausible reasons, really just it strikes them, and like more than one reason too. Now look, you only need like one really good argument, right? But so I just find that itself is a very powerful thing to use in conversations with people, is just have your list of reasons, whatever they are. They don't have to be the same thing that I did, but whatever and they should be authentic to you, right? But well thought out reasons of why you believe this. And what you'll find more often than not is just by listing those reasons, it can move people. And again, they don't necessarily change their mind on the spot, but it can really get them to take another look that they would have never have thought to take before. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that segues into one of the other topics here. In fact, I'll flip-flop these. We're talking about the Eucharist, but then also about the debate between Trent Horn and Matt Dillahunty. So let's
kind
of
which I haven't watched. So excuse me if I'm ignorant on some of the details, but whatever you want to go ahead.
Yeah, totally fine. Yeah. Well, I gave a little bit of a summary in our last dialogue, but the short of it again is it reasonable to believe in the resurrection? So the overall format, and apparently there was a change in the format, and you get that kind of the beginning of the debate. It was a little janky, but originally it was going to be opening statements and then about 40 minutes or so of just open conversation, just free conversation. But then they added 8-minute rebuttals after the opening statements, like 2 8-minute rebuttal, and then the cross-examination open conversation. So it was pretty formal overall, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
They kind of, they sort of customize it a bit. So, a couple of key takeaways from this and how we dialogue with atheists, agnostics, atheists/agnostics too, is, for example, Matt Dillahunty, okay? As I've mentioned before, he's a pretty well-known, figure within the atheist community. And because too, he's had this really tell it like it is, and just sort of, you see comments on YouTube now quite a bit, so-and-so destroys so-and-so, on this topic, like just destroy it. It's kind of a little, it's a little ridiculous, but, he's built his reputation over the past 15, 16 years or so. He's been hosting this show called The Atheist Experience, or co-hosting two at times for years and years upon years. And I watched it for quite some time. And I was so impressed how he could corner so many people into the, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know that? And of course that leads into like providing more according to a scientific method, right? Some evidence or something that will, get, for example, maybe open the possibility of believing. But then of course, and I mentioned this in our last dialogue, the one you and I had, that, it also gets boiled down to, right? Which I believe he said in this past debate too, like, what would it look like, the evidence look like? So on one hand, it's like, I need evidence, but on the other hand, I don't know exactly what it would look like, right? So then that dove into, and I'm going to stop right here. It's the first thought about this, okay? Because let's just keep it to a couple of central takeaways.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
First is about historical claims, about evidence. And so, Dillahunty's position is claims are just claims. They're not evidence, right? The difference between claims and evidence, okay? So Trent's point, arguments that was, well, then you would have to, and I'm sort of paraphrasing this, but then you would have to throw out like 80% of history, okay? Because there's so much of it that's documented that you just have accounts, and sometimes 50, 100, a few hundred years after, but yet in the, for example, historians or scholars, they accept a lot of claim-based or account-based,
Claims are certainly evidence in forensic sciences. There's no dispute about that, right? And he's making a claim there. And should we take that as evidence of a position, right? The claim that claims aren't evidence is itself a claim.
It's a claim itself, right? Yeah.
And so, like, this is what worries me about popular YouTube atheists. And I don't know enough about Dillahunty that I'm going to be hesitant to say too much. But let me say this, right? If you want to evaluate positions, and this I got from, I didn't get this from this gentleman, but he reiterates it. And I think he's absolutely right. And he is himself an atheist, and he's a very smart atheist in philosophy of religion. His name's Graham Oppie. He says, if you want to evaluate positions, you should go to the most relevant experts who disagree and look at their disagreements, right? Like, and this is right. Like, if you really want to evaluate positions, go and try and go to the end of the rainbow. Try to find the best of the people who can articulate each side and weigh it out there, right? Don't start with just popularizers, right? Go to the people who are the specialized experts and stuff. And you go to somebody who's a specialized expert in the contingency argument, and then go to somebody who's a specialized skeptic, right, in philosophy of religion, and see who wins out, to your mind, on the arguments. And that's where you should adjudicate it, not popularizers and YouTube days, because a lot of times you get this stuff that's like rhetorically fancy or has emotional power, or it's just said with a lot of confidence, like claims are not evidence. But like, you don't see that stuff in the serious academic debates because it's not serious. Like, it's just not serious. Or if you try to set an epistemology that's too skeptical, where you're going to try to rule out anything that could give warrant, say, to a reasonable Christian belief, chances are, certainly chances are, but I might even want to say almost certainly, that quirky epistemology is going to rule out a host of a number of other things that are very reasonable to believe. And so then that's a problem with your epistemology, son. That's not a problem with Christianity, right? And it sounds like that's what you're summarizing to me, is that this Dillahunty gentleman is trying to dial up the skepticism so high, and in doing so, he's restricting his epistemology so much to not even allow anything that really is evidence count as evidence in his paradigm. So, like, you can't even get into the historical debates about Christianity because his epistemology is so restricted. But then the problem is that he's going to have to reject testimonial evidence for pretty much all of human history, right? And no reasonable person does that. No reasonable person should do that. That's ridiculous. Not just in history, but we accept testimonial evidence all the time. Historical reports of scientific findings. We accept testimony that scientists reported their results fairly, accurately, right? That they were moral in their conduct. Most of us are not running and repeating all the different scientific experiments and seeing and verifying all this for ourselves. We accept it based on multiple levels of testimony, right? And authority. So this is something that we all, even for science to a certain degree, it's a different degree than history, but it's still testimonial evidence. Reliance on testimony and authority is something that, if your epistemology cannot accommodate that, doesn't mean we have to accept everything just on pure blind faith. There's ways to try and adjudicate whether testimony is more reliable or less, right? But if your epistemology just tries to rule all of that out of court, that's not a threat to Christianity. Like I'm just not taking that seriously. That's just you just trying to fudge around with a quirky skepticism and epistemology, because it seems like you just have an animus against Christianity. Like you just. And again, maybe I'm doing some armchair psychoanalysis here, but it's hard to take that type of approach seriously, because it seems to me so ad hoc, right? It seems like most of the time I'm probably running through my life with my skepticism dial around 1 or 2, but then when it comes to debates around Christianity, and this is what we said last time, I crank it to 11. I spinal tap that skepticism, right? See what I'm saying? But in doing so, I cut off so many other reasonable beliefs. And might even be self-defeating for my own position. Like if I say that claims aren't evidence, but then I make a claim that is supposed to count as evidence for the claim that claims aren't evidence. Well, now we've got an issue with that, right? Mm-hmm. So those are just some few remarks, again, not having watched the full debate.
Yeah, he seems pretty hung up, and I'd say overall are pretty accurate, and kind of, and it always helps to, for example, you watch a debate or get more familiar with the person in the debate, like say Matt Dillahunty, but I think your perspective still has a lot of validity.
Well, even if that's not as specific to Dillahunty, that is a type of mentality,
right?
Approach that certainly is out there and is very common. So take that specific application for whatever it's worth. Maybe it applies, maybe it doesn't. But if you haven't already, you will encounter many people who do exactly what I've just described, right?
Right, and he carries some of those characteristics for sure, and including that he is a bit hung up on testimonial evidence, because there's a lot of this back and forth, and then relating it to court, going to court, and for example, like if it's a trial for a crime, and talking about testimonial evidence, talking about how it's thrown out all the time, but then it is accepted. But then, for example, you can get a lot, biases, multiple. Okay, so one of Trent's points, and I agreed to that, and to Trent's point about having a bias. Okay, like for example, let's say I'm out one night, I've played a show with my band, and afterwards, and say it's kind of in a shady area, and then say something happens that somebody comes up and, I don't know, tries to mug me, or too, and let's say that I say I do get mugged, like somebody steals my wallet, and I try to stop the situation, but I can't fully stop. But then I tell the story that somebody did get my wallet, but I was able to kind of, I tackled the person, something like down before he escaped, like, to just kind of maybe save some face or something, or just add some kind of bias to it, right? Or some need to like validate, my part of the story. It doesn't mean it didn't happen though either, right? Like, that the truth is that I did get mugged, maybe if I did embellish some of that, and that just happens sometimes. But that was some of Trent's point, that even if there may be little, even if whether it's from grammatical errors to scribal, or related to scribal errors, or if it's something that somebody may sound like that they're kind of have a little more sort of bias kind of implanted with that, doesn't mean that, again, that it's any less true, the story itself, the core of, the story, right? Which maybe is not even the best example, but.
No, but it's a good point, but they're unrelated points, because now we actually are getting into, okay, what sort of criteria should we look for reliable testimonial evidence?
Right, yeah, which leads right to that, right, yep.
And that of course is perfectly legitimate, right? Like we do want to know, like, okay, how can we screen for bias? Like, and this is where historians look for things like proximity to the situation, degree of ad hocness, embarrassing details, independent attestation. Like these criteria exist, right? Like we've kind of figured this out, or at least we figured out enough of it to be able to adjudicate whether or not historical claims are reliable and should be counted as evidence or not, whether they meet certain criteria, and at least meet a minimum number of that criteria. But if they meet more of that criteria, then they just they become sort of historical pay dirt, right? Like they're like really solid. And anybody who's taken sort of the core facts of Christianity seriously from a historical perspective realize that it meets those criteria, right? And that's the key, is that we do have criteria for adjudication of whether something is historically reliable or not. And considering the core claims of Christianity, at least what we need to kind of launch into some type of supernatural explanation for those data points, right? We have the historical attestation and the criteria met that we need to say, like, these are well-grounded historical details. Okay, now let's explain those historical details. No naturalistic hypothesis can do it. That's fine. We've already got theism on the table because we just ran a contingency argument, right? That can explain it really well. It seems like it's really fitting. It meets a certain degree of expectation. It becomes very reasonable to accept. Now, my guess, and again, why do skeptics like Dillahunty, or put him off the table? Why would skeptics take the overly skeptical approach? I think it's an underhanded compliment to Christianity, because I think in a sense that they've realized that if you actually allow the debate to get into the historical details, to get into the weeds of whether this criteria is met or not, it's really hard to show that the criteria isn't met or can't be met. And then you're kind of on your heels as a skeptic. So what you have to do, what they feel they might have to do instead, is just try and make sure that the debate never gets there, right? Make sure that we dial up the skepticism so high that we can't even admit any testimonial evidence, any historical claims whatsoever. But again, I'll just reiterate my point. I just think that that's so ridiculous that it's just such an ad hoc, quirky epistemology, and it's going to rule out so many reasonable beliefs, things that we run our everyday assumptions on, right? That there's no reason to take that position seriously. Mm-hmm. But so in a sense, I do think it's sort of an underhanded compliment. It's sort of at least, a subconscious realization that there's a real credible case to be made historically for Christianity, that you kind of have to just like try and make the whole project of history just unavailable altogether as a skeptic. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, excellent point. So I'm curious now, when you were learning more about the Catholic faith and pursuing that, seeking that out, what clinched it for you regarding the resurrection? Out of curiosity, knowing how you approach, truth and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good question. What clinched it for me? Well, certainly I was interested in the historical details, right? And I really wanted to know, okay, is there a strong historical case that could be made for Christianity? And so, there's a lot of good books on that. Like you have Mike Lacona's A New Historiographic Approach. You have N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. Bill Craig's done good work on it. The Sun Rises. So like really good detailed academic work from top-rate scholars who can make the case. So that was influential to me. And then again, like I'm an End of the Rainbow guy. So like I wanted to see what the best people here said and the best people there said. There's various skeptics, Jesus Seminar guys, Bart Ehrman, and it seemed completely asymmetric to me. It just seemed like, yeah, Christianity's definitely got a huge advantage here. But then there's also prior philosophical considerations. So, like I had kind of already arrived at a robust theism, a Thomism. And, how you look at a historical portrait like that, or how that historical portrait presents itself to you will depend greatly on your prior philosophical considerations, right? So if you already think that God exists and is perfectly good and is the creator of all else that is, and if you think that something in the world has gone terribly wrong, which it seems like it does, like, does it make sense that God might want to try and set that straight in some way? Does it make sense that something like the incarnation and atonement could fit? Could I predict that that's exactly the way that God would do that? No, of course not. Like, what's the probability that God would do something like that? I have no idea. But whatever the probability of those historical details are, the fact that they have emerged, right? The fact that we have those historical details is so much more probable on theism than atheism. And it's that ratio that matters, right? It's that ratio that matters. Like if atheism were true, I would never expect there to be anything like any sort of plausible historical case for Christianity at all. Like that just, I don't see how that could possibly come about. Or it's just so minutely small. Now, again, what probability do I assign that God would decide to do things exactly the way he did? I have no idea. But the fact that it really seems to be like this happened, like that counts so greatly in favor of and fits so much better with the theistic hypothesis that I would just much rather, it's just much more reasonable and responsible to run that hypothesis all the way through. You follow what I'm saying, right? It's like, give a kind of another epistemological example here, right? If there's a house in the woods and I'm not sure whether the house is occupied or not. Maybe it's an abandoned house. Maybe it's an occupied house, right? If somebody's in there, what's the probability that there will be a cup of hot tea steeping? I have no idea, right? I have no. Do they like tea? I have no idea. However, if that house is completely abandoned, what's the probability that there'll be a cup of hot tea steeping? You see what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Well, again, I have no idea, but I can tell you that there's a ratio there, right? And that if I find a cup of hot tea steeping in that house, I'm going to be virtually certain that somebody is in that house, right? You see what I'm saying, right? So if you can get that in your mind about this ratio of what would be more expected given one hypothesis versus the next, replace the cup of tea of the historical details around Jesus and ask, is this more expected on theism or atheism? And think about that ratio. It's theism all the way. Like, I just think it's just such a clear-cut, obvious thing, right? And then if you already have independent reasons for theism, it just fits so incredibly well that I think it just becomes so. I like to use the term reasonable and responsible to accept that. I don't think you have to accept it. I don't think God works that way, but certainly it's reasonable and responsible to accept it. And that's the way that I think about it. I think that's probably one of the most helpful ways to think about it, because it does, when you think about it like that, I think it does present itself as such a reasonable option. And then it's just a good option. Like, this is great news. And if it's reasonable and it's good news, then I think you should go for it. Mm-hmm.
So I have another question for you then. What first jumped out at you when you first started studying St. Thomas Aquinas? And so, like, what first popped out that, okay, wow, I need to read more about this guy? So, like, was there something initially that just jumped out?
Yeah. Let me just go back to the resurrection stuff real quick, because
Sure.
I feel like I may have skimped a few details. Right? Is that there are just important historical facts that I think if you want to vet these out, just check out those books that I recommended, like things like the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the rise of Christian belief. These things are just they're not the types of things that I would expect there to be any type of historical support for if theism and Christianity weren't true. So I just want to say that. Now, getting back to Thomas Aquinas, yeah, I often say, like, I stumbled upon the Thomistic tradition as a whole. So it wasn't like I just found Aquinas, right? The first kind of Thomist that I really read was a guy named Mortimer J. Adler. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him at all. Yeah, really smart guy, very interesting in himself. So he was an agnostic. I think he was Jewish, right? So he's Jewish, became agnostic, philosopher, writer, really brilliant guy. Very dissatisfied with secular philosophies. He himself discovered Thomas Aquinas. He then became a Thomist, became a Christian kind of midlife, I feel like maybe 40s or 50s, and then became Catholic in his 90s, like 3 years before he died. He became Catholic. And he's just got prolific amounts of work. He's got a book that I read when I was pretty young that I loved called How to Read a Book. And that was the only book I read from Adler for a long time. But I knew he had other works. And eventually, as I started taking seriously more questions of God's existence, I remembered that he had books on, forget how I initially remembered it, but he has a specific book called How to Think About God. And it's called How to Think About God, something from a pagan perspective or something, because he was still a pagan when he wrote this book, right? He wasn't a Christian yet. And in this book, he gives a contingency-based argument. And so that was sort of like what got me really interested when I first had like my aha moment. I was like, oh wow, didn't convince me right away, right? Like, I still had my objections and stuff like that, but like, this seems very well reasoned. Like, this guy is not an idiot, and he's giving an argument that's exceedingly well written. I'm not exactly sure what to do with it. I'm a little skeptical. But I want to look more into this, right? I want to look more into this. So he just kind of like introduced me to the whole Thomistic tradition in a sense. And of course I was, always, not always, but I was reading a lot of the other like just classic perennial philosophers at this time as well. But he was my first step into Thomism. So then it's just like as much as I can devour type of thing, not just of Thomas himself, but all these other contemporary Thomists, anybody associated with this school of thought. I was just all about it. People like Bernard Lonergan, Father Norris Clark, those two were huge for me too. Lonergan and Clark. I like even more than Thomas himself in many respects were Lonergan and Clark on my thinking and sort of my movement, not just to theism, but Christianity as well. What struck me about it was its synthetic and systematic approach, right? Is that it explains everything. It explains everything really well in a non-ad hoc way, and it's all deeply integrated, right? So it gives you an ontology, it gives you a metaphysics, but connected with that and coming from that is an ethics, and bound up in all of that is a philosophical anthropology of the human person, and really well nestled inside of that, we have an epistemology, a relational realism. So it's the synthetic and systematic power of Thomism to offer an elegant, beautiful, and adequate explanation of all the things I was looking for an explanation for. That was a single most attractive thing about it for me, whereas nothing else comes even close. Nothing else comes even close. Now, I say Thomism thinking that it is sort of just like the capstone of Big Tent Platonism. Right. Yeah. So for me, like Thomism, like it is like the perfection and the highest articulation of a Platonism, right? Distinct from so many of the now sort of various scattered and variegated modern philosophies. So that's how I would begin to answer that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's I don't have any thoughts to that too. Going back to the resurrection. And also I think I'm close to wrapping that up about the debate, because there were definitely a number of takeaways, but some of the core ones. And also in just dialoguing with again what I call doubters or atheists.
Well, let me give something for people who are interested in dialogue and searching out. I mentioned an atheist who's very smart. His name's Graham Oppy. And there's a book out called 4 Views on Christianity, and it's 4 philosophers just coming at it and arguing from different positions. Okay. And I would encourage people, go get that book and read it. There's a philosopher in there named Timothy McGrew. He's a friend of mine, professional philosopher, and he's going at it with Graham Oppy. Go and read it. Go read Oppy's take. Go read McGrew's take, because they not only argue about God, but they argue about miracle claims, the resurrection. So just go see what people who are at the top of their game, relevant, specialized experts, see what comes out of their clash. And I won't even say much more about that. Like, I'm just go see that exchange, right, and start there.
Yeah. So let me ask you this though too, okay? Because I get one final thought about this on this topic, right? So we both agree that yes, claims can count as evidence, right? In his historical claims. Okay. When people line up though on one side or the other, right? You have people, say you and I, who have worked through a lot of that, okay, the reasons why it can be, and then you may have somebody on the other side, right, skeptic, the like 11 scale of skeptic, right, and talking with you, your amp turned up to 11. What is a good, and they're, and they've written off claims, as evidence. Well, maybe that's just a conversation stopper right there. What do you think is a good example or starter to start the bridge to that claims and testimony do have their validity? And one, we could just say that, there are many scholars, even Trent Horn said it in the debate, widely accepted among many scholars. Like, he gives an example, he's given it in the past too, of Alexander the Great, that his life was, documented, much of it, that history, almost 400 years after.
Right. I mean, just start with the statement itself. Like, I think it's important to see it's like, I'm saying something. I'm setting a standard by what I'm saying.
Yeah, like what is that standard?
Do I meet my own standard?
Yeah.
Now, if you're saying that claims aren't evidence, it sounds like you're saying that you shouldn't take claims seriously, but you're making a claim.
Yeah.
You're making a claim. Now, why?
Right, we talked about that. Yeah.
Right. So, like, immediately there's an issue there. Now, maybe there's a response to that. I don't know. I haven't heard Dillahunty, but like, that's the first thing I think about is like, you're making a claim. I would certainly want more evidence for it. And like, there's just a lot of ambiguity there. Like, what do you mean by claim? Of course, there's many claims that people just say like that one that I don't think should be taken seriously. Right. But at the same time is various forensic sciences, certainly is related to New Testament scholarship, right? But other, the huge swath of historical sciences, right? They admit claims, in a very broad general sense, testimonial evidence, because they have established criteria, right, of how to try to evaluate whether or not these various claims are or are not reliable. And that's why they're considered a science, right? Because there's criteria, right? It's done systematically, right? To try and get, fruitful results from these inquiries. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to say something like that and you're going to try and exclude all of history, you're just going to have to take an extremely fringe position and say that the vast majority of things that we hold as being very reasonable, about former U.S. presidents, right? Stuff like that, like Abraham Lincoln, right? Are we going to really throw all that stuff out, right? I don't think anybody is going to want to do that. So I think the move here, Chris, and again, I'm kind of detached from the debate, so I'm sorry if I'm missing a point, is to show what the intellectual cost is going to be if you actually adopt that position, and show that that cost is very high indeed. And it's a higher cost than any reasonable person should want to adopt. And I think clearly in that case, it's going to be, because I don't think that there's going to be a way that you can try and take that skeptical of a position and like just undermine or exclude Christianity without undermining or excluding so much of what very reputable, very intelligent people hold to be reasonable and responsible beliefs, right? I think that's going to gotta be the approach. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's take that, what you just said right now. Now let's shift this over to, I mentioned a third topic, sacraments, specifically the Eucharist, right? So if we take all that we've discussed so far regarding the resurrection, but now we apply it to we as Catholics, okay, and how we understand our belief, okay, and tradition, scripture and tradition, okay? So if we think about it, we have historical accounts of, and also what was written in the Gospels of, what people know, the Last Supper, right, too, and doing that in memory of Christ, right? So as we celebrate the Eucharist, that core part of the Mass, okay, and actually a core part of our Catholic life too. So we understand that. We know it's been a tradition for about 2,000 years, okay? We have all the consistency to show that if you dive deep into, have been keeping that pretty consistent as a tradition all this time. And yet now we have, in fact, in my gospel reflection for this past week, I abridged that passage about Christ and the parable of him as the vine and we as the branches, too, from John chapter 15, verses 1-8. And I bridge this in and talking about the Eucharist because, something that's, a bit alarming is that it's only about a third of Catholics who believe in the real presence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Christ in the Eucharist, right? So I've been thinking a lot about this and I spoke to some of it in that reflection. So your thoughts on that, go and explain the truth of that and helping reshift this around to something that's so fundamental to what we're supposed to believe.
Yeah, well, it depends who I'm talking to, right? If I'm talking to an atheist, I'm not going to make an argument for the Eucharist because that's so far downstream.
Sorry. Yeah, let's start with fellow Catholics who are kind
of. No, I think what the first thing every Catholic needs to do immediately, whether or not you actually believe what the Church teaches on this, and you absolutely should, is you need to get Brant Petre's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, and you need to read that front to back. I don't know if you've read that one, Chris, but it is an incredible theological exploration of the Jewish roots of the Eucharist, right? Of showing why Christ, as the new sacrificial lamb, why this makes so much sense, right? As a new manna from heaven, right? And when you understand the Old Testament prefigurements, like, of course God did it this way. So like in isolation, it could seem strange, but in consideration of the Jewish backdrop, right? We knew we needed an unblemished lamb. We knew that God would provide the sacrifice. We knew that the lamb's blood had to be spilt. And importantly, in the Jewish Passover, it was never complete until you what? Ate the lamb.
Right, right. Yep.
Ate the lamb.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Starting to connect some dots now, right? So I'm just giving a brief sketch, but you can see why then something like transubstantiation in the Eucharist makes beautiful sense, right? It makes perfect sense. Now, what are the mechanics of that? Believe me, there's lots of different philosophical accounts. I don't think that's important. I think you can just accept that if this is what God instituted, it's a great mystery. We can be in reverence of it. We can accept it. It's reasonable and responsible to accept it, even if we don't know all the mechanics of it, right? Fun to contemplate that stuff, but not necessary, right? If we already trust that this is what God willed, great. We can accept that on faith. It fits extremely well with a general participation metaphysics, right? So, how do we have this great and intimate union, which we believe as Catholics, not just with the Holy Spirit, but with Christ himself, right? And this is the Eucharist, right? It's not just that, that we're when we're receiving the Eucharist, that we're just eating Christ. Yes, that's true. But it's more that it's sort of the reversal. When we typically eat things that's assimilated into us, with the Eucharist, it's actually us being assimilated into Christ.
Exactly.
Into Christ.
Exactly.
And also, I think there's some great metaphysical support for this. So yeah, you have this participation scheme, which is great, which I think, again, coming from my kind of Thomistic perspective, it's like, oh, of course God did it this way. This makes sense. Also through secondary causes and instituting things that are befitting to human nature. I think that's another important consideration that people overlook, right? There's kind of been this hyper-Gnostic spiritualization of Christianity. Certainly it has great roots, but it's become more prominent, where there's sort of, again, this kind of shunning of everything that is befitting of human nature, physical things, communal things, institutional things, hierarchical things. Like, that's who we are. Like, that's what we do. We're physical. We organize the communities. We form institutions, right? Well, God, a wise God, not only created these natures that give us these dispositions to do these different things, right? But a wise God works with things according to their nature, right? He governs things according to their nature. Now, in the Old Testament, God always worked through physical stuff. We already talked about the manna from heaven, prophets, right? Stuff like that. Might it make sense that a God who loves secondary causes will still work through physical stuff here and now, even today? Yes, of course it makes sense. It makes metaphysical sense. It's beautifully consistent with what came before. And so the sacraments of Catholic theology fit, again, really well metaphysically, right? We're physical creatures. We're physical, so it's not just the Eucharist. Certainly the Eucharist, right? We have the bread and the wine and transubstantiation. So that's a physical reality that we can touch and feel and taste, and that makes sense because we're physical creatures. But confession as well, yes. Right? We are physical creatures. God wants us to have the audible assurance of your sins are forgiven. Why? Because that makes sense to us, right? That's who we are. That's what we are. We are physical creatures. God works with things according to their nature. He worked through physical things before. He works through physical things now. If you have a participation scheme work, there's no competitiveness between these levels of causality, right? It's really Christ forgiving your sins through the priest, right? So it's not like this arbitrary middleman that's getting the metaphysics all wrong, right? It's really Christ, right? Transubstantiation, real presence. And even more technically, we have real absence too. If you want to dive deeper into the metaphysics of it, Catholics believe not just in real presence, but real absence, right? Like, it's a full transubstantiation. It's not like Christ along with the bread. It's really and fully Christ present there. Trans meaning across, substance. So across substance, that's kind of where that term comes from, right? So why am I saying this? Again, I'm saying there's a convergence of different reasons that make beautiful sense of Catholic sacramental theology. You have the Jewish Old Testament roots, you have metaphysical reasons, participation metaphysics, instrumental causality, you have philosophical anthropology guided reasons, what human nature is, a wise God working with us according to our natures, right? And of course, you just have the independent support that God gave us in an indefectible church and magisterium as well. And if this is what the church teaches, then we should believe it, because the church has magisterial teaching authority, right? So you're a fool if you don't, if you're a Catholic, if you're already a Catholic and you don't believe what the church teaches on this, then either you seriously don't understand what it means to be Catholic, which is fine, right? Hey, we all like, there was a time when I had no idea what it meant, right?
Sure.
But hey, use that as an opportunity. Get Brant Petrie's book. So let me just say that. Just get Brant Petrie's book. Start there. Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. I promise you, it's gonna. If you already believe it, it's just gonna make you believe it so much more. It's gonna be so edifying. If you don't believe it, or you're skeptical about it, but you're just already Catholic, like you've already made, at least you're that far, I think this book will change your mind. I really do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is a good book. I agree with you on that too. I'm going to link actually in the video here when I upload it. Yeah, because it's an effective book. Well, and I go back to something I mentioned earlier in our conversation here, again, about in talking with skeptics, right? Which then you qualify Catholics who no longer believe in the presence now as being skeptical, or, rejecting it, or rejecting the idea, or claim, or they're maybe on the fence about it. And again, we go back to that good old word, truth, and establishing truth of it. Again, like, okay, if you believe in Christ, right, that's, as we understand that too, then what Christ said is true, right? And if he said what he said is true, and he instructed us to participate in this and be in this communion with him, right, of taking in the sacrament, okay, that's true. And the church has kept that, upheld that all this time.
Right. And this was something that really struck me when I was studying the earliest Christians, right? The devotion and the adherence to the real presence. Like, it wasn't something that they argued to. It was something they argued from. Right. It was such a baseline assumption. It was such an obvious belief that really, really struck me. Like, okay, this goes all the way back, right? This goes all the way back. And it's not just that, but like when you read again the earliest Christians, you read things where they're talking about not just, the bread of life, which really is Christ, but they talk about things like altars when it comes to worship. Now that's interesting, right? Because what's an altar for? And you don't really find altars in Protestant congregations. Oh, that's right. An altar is for sacrifice, right? And sacrifice is the highest form of worship, right? That's what it has always been. So the Catholic Mass is just a reparticipation in the one perfect eternal sacrifice that Christ made to God, right? A reparticipation, a representation, not a re-sacrificing. That's getting it wrong. A re-partaking in and a representation of that one perfect sacrifice that Christ made for all of us, right? So that's huge, right? You have the historical support. Of course, you have the biblical support, right? Like this is the only scene in the Gospels where Christ teaches something where he not only doesn't clarify, saying like, I'm just speaking allegorically, when he's of course saying my flesh is food indeed, my blood is drink indeed, right? He doubles down, and then people leave him, and it's the only time people leave him, because it was such, they say this is such a hard teaching. How can we believe this?
Yep.
And he does not back down. He doubles down, right? And what does Peter say? He says something very beautiful. When Christ asks, "Are you guys going to leave me too?" He says, "Where else are we going to go, Lord?" Right? It's you or bust, right? You have the words of eternal life. So he gets it. Like, yeah, this is a hard thing, but I know who you are. This is what you're teaching. This is what you're willing. So I'd be a fool not to believe it. Even if I don't understand it, I'd be a fool not to believe it, right? And that's a very reasonable thing, right? If you have independent reasons to really trust somebody, even if you don't fully understand what they're telling you or teaching you, if you know this is a credible authority, and what could be more of a credible authority than God and Christ, then you can accept that very reasonably and responsibly, even if it remains a profound mystery to you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and to add to that, I was going to share something with you from this reflection, that I have a written version of all my video blogs too. So I have a separate blog site for that. And so something I said kind of, it does tie into this, and specifically to Catholics, In fact, I mentioned earlier in the video that I said that even when I was an atheist, I used to tell people exploring spirituality that if they were going to investigate any faith, it should be Catholic. And this, okay, ties into real presence, and about the Mass, like which we just discussed, that the whole premise of the Mass is to have a powerfully transcendental experience with God, and that every Mass includes I put it, supernatural event, really transubstantiation. So then I finish with this. I said, therefore, for those who want a deeply meaningful relationship with God, what more powerful way than to be in a miraculous supernatural communion in God through the Eucharist, and what more powerful way to honor and fully embrace Christ's excruciating sacrifice and then glorious resurrection for us. Like, as to your point, like the highest form of worship, the highest honor of being in communion with that sacrifice, of going back to an earlier point of that this isn't about me in this moment. Of course, it's about building that relationship, nurturing that relationship with God. But it's something so intimate and in that moment personal of connecting with Christ in that way, and accepting that, and that it's supposed to, heal us too. That sacrament of the Eucharist, that's the idea with it also in taking it, that, this is, as you said, you're now becoming assimilated into Christ and accepting his healing right with that,
That's right. Yeah. And to the point of, I want a relationship with God. Great. That's what we're made for. Right. But follow me on this, right? Like if Christ is God, let's say we got there.
Right.
And then Christ said some specific things, right? John 14, I was just reading it today. If you love me, you will follow my commandments.
Yes.
If you love me, you will follow my commandment. He's saying, this is how I want you to have a relationship with me, right? It's been specified, right? So if this is what you're seeking, a relationship with God, and we want to consider, does the other member of this relationship have any input on how this relationship should go?
Yeah.
It seems like he does, right? And of course, Christ gave us many commandments, right? He issued many commandments, but certainly one of them, of course, is to partake in the Eucharist, to become a part of his church, right? To love God and neighbor above all, many things. He had the Sermon on the Mount, lots of stuff. Like he wasn't short on like giving us things to do, right? Like, but he's very explicit. Like, if you love me, it's not just, he didn't say, if you love me, that's cool, go do whatever you want, right? No. That's exactly not, what Christ left us with. He calls us to take up a cross. He calls us to follow his commandments. And of course, so much of that involves a lot of hardship. It does. Religion, true religion, Catholicism, it's not easy, right? It makes serious demands. Now, we believe that God will give us grace sufficient for all that. It's grace first, right? Gratia prima. And so long as we don't resist interior grace and we cooperate with it, God will give us everything we need to reach our ultimate end, to reach our ultimate happiness. So yes, nothing good can come apart from God being that first mover, right? Definitely, metaphysically, scripturally, that's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that it's still not hard. It's still not a hard go, and that is the tough truth of Catholicism. Is that, and I'll just kind of say this, another Starkey rock. Like if your religion isn't making any demands on you, if it's not challenging you in any way, like, maybe you should consider that it's a false religion. Maybe you should consider that you have just invented something for your own fancy and your convenience. That is not going to be the case with the Catholicism. Catholicism doesn't promise you an easy life here and now. In fact, it pretty much promises you the opposite. It promises you the opportunity to take up your cross. And it promises you not a release from suffering. It's not Buddhism. It promises you the eventual transformation of your suffering. That's what it promises you. That's an amazing promise. Right. But we have to be realistic about what that promise is. It's a hard go. Religion is a manly thing, right? And that's why, and like, even if you're a woman, it's a manly thing, right? Yeah. This is why we have the virtues, not just of faith and love, but hope. Hope is the fighter's virtue, right? It's the boxer's virtue. Endurance, of course, another important virtue. Fortitude. We need these virtues because they are just part and parcel of the religious life, which is not easy.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's why and I could use, wow, many different kind of expressions for this, but it's like either jump on the train or you're out. Sometimes it does boil down to an either or. I struggled with this some time before I reverted to Catholic. A lot of that was just being stubborn, right? And this idea of like, okay, am I going to accept it or not? And there seems to be a lot of, concern about that, you accept it, and then are you like losing yourself to something maybe you don't believe, but then it just circles back to, again, if you believe in the truth of it, it's either 100%. It's kind of like
it's all or nothing. Yeah, it is.
100 or zero. It's not. Yeah. How do you operate 50 or 70 or 80? In between. It's not. Yeah.
You give your life to it. Yeah, and that doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect, right? Like we all screw up. We all sin, right? We all need. That's why we have confession, right? That's why we have mass, right, to help us. But to your point, you're absolutely right. I reached that point myself where I just like, because I think this is true, like I can't piecemeal this. Like I can't just take what I like and leave what I don't. It's got to be all in.
Yeah.
It's got to be all or nothing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. Yeah, because then it gets a little awkward in the territory of when you start kind of cherry picking, beliefs, because then you live in the kind of just land of subjectivity.
But then then you don't understand Catholicism, because Catholicism comes in defectibility. That is a core claim, right? Yeah. So if you don't accept or understand indefectibility on matters of faith and morals, then if you don't believe that's true, then you shouldn't be Catholic.
Yeah, that's the reality of it, right? Well, to use
if you don't think that's true, then you should be Catholic. But if you do think that's true, this core claim of authority, of magisterial authority, then it makes no sense to think that the church could be right on these things, but then you not want to follow them, right? Because the reason the church is right on these things is because God is guiding and protecting his church on matters that are essential for your good and for your salvation. So it's like saying, I know this is really good for me and my salvation, but I just don't want to do it. And that's highly irrational, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, man. Really. And good thoughts, really, on that too. Well, I've covered, a few topics here too, and of course, really great discussion so far. I know if you wanted to bounce any questions in return or two. We've had a pretty good dialogue.
Yeah, this has been good, man. We covered a lot of territory, and I knew that we could just turn the mics on and have some fun. And
seriously. Yeah, well, as said, and without overdoing the compliment with it, I appreciate your perspective. I do, and it's always great to dialogue with somebody that, not to say that I don't learn from anybody else, but that can vary in different degrees, but I've appreciated especially your approach, from a philosophical standpoint, and then marrying that with, our being Catholics, and faith, and then even how you can have dialogues, with variety of people based on that. It's always great to talk to somebody where I take away a lot from that and think about it, and then can even apply it maybe in my own, conversation.
Well, thank you, Chris. And certainly the feeling is mutual. I love these conversations. I always gain insights hearing other people's perspectives and thoughts on things, Catholic or otherwise, right?
Right.
And let me just say, for anybody who hears this again, who's not Catholic, it's just seeking and searching and dialogue. Like, this is good, right? This is how we try to get at the truth of things. So I'm not here to try and like knock anybody down, right? You've asked me some questions. I've tried to give you a straightforward answer. Maybe that lowers some barriers for people to continue seeking, to continue prodding. And maybe that will give us, and if so, and you hear about that, maybe that will give us topics for future exploration. And I would be excited to go on those explorations if they come up.
Yeah, and I imagine they will. And speaking of which, we'll have a good trip. So I want to ask real quick. So you're away for a couple of weeks, or are you doing anything special?
Yeah, 2 weeks. Just going to visit my wife's family in North Carolina, Wilmington area. So I've never been.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay.
So yeah, but that's where we'll be. 2 weeks. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, definitely. Well, hit me up. Sometime after you get back. Check in. What you're doing, and then we could plan again another dialogue. I'm sure I'll have some more topics. I've got a running list.
Good, man. Hey, yeah, I love it, man. It's all fun. I certainly like you'll run me out here sooner or later. I've got my few areas of competency and specialization, but it's definitely not I often give the very big disclaimer, like I am not a I'm not an apologist, right? Well, I am and I'm not, right? Like I give reasons for what I believe, so in that sense, I'm an apologist. But you have these sort of, I guess, professional apologists, I should say. Like their one thing is to like examine every nook and cranny of how to support and defend the Catholic faith from any possible objection that comes out. Um, I sort of stumbled into an apologetic role because of the way I came to Catholicism. I just worked through so many different objections that in conversations with people, they realized that I had worked through those objections and they found that helpful. And then
Mm.
people started calling me in for apologetical conversations. I'm like, okay, I guess we're doing this now.
Right.
But if it's helpful for people, I'm happy to do it. Let me just finish with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, keep, keep doing what you're doing, and we'll definitely keep in contact, plan future dialogues. And yeah, thanks again, for this. I always really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you.